Good luck, man.
All right. I see one participant. Are you there? Are you receiving me? Greg, hi. Greg X, how am I enjoying the tech challenges? Yeah, I am not tech savvy, and I'm going to be endeavoring next month to help interested folks play games on Vassal. And I've actually lately gotten to the point where I can actually modify Vassal modules myself, which, if you know anything about me, is just a remarkable development, all pressed by the needs of this shutdown. So yeah, I'm enjoying the tech challenges in that it's an opportunity to learn and grow. How about that? Hello, everyone. So I see Greg, I see Der Blaue Klaus, and Rolf Lacker. Hello. So I think I had said I would try to start up at 20 minutes after. I've got 16 minutes after now, so I'll give a few more minutes for other folks to join, and then I guess we'll convene officially. And again, my apologies. I didn't have a chance to test out the compatibility of my hamster wheel computer with YouTube Studio earlier. Then I should have done it. Should have done it yesterday or some other time, and not just a few minutes before. So that's on me, and sorry to have taken that 20 minutes of your time that I will not be able to return to your lives productively, I'm afraid. Vassal, Greg commenting, Vassal not being intuitive. It's interesting to me about Vassal and Tabletop Simulator. And as we're looking at folks signing up for the San Diego Historical Convention next month, keeping stats, and there's a nice even divide between folks choosing Vassal, or rather in terms of, this isn't just players, but these are folks offering events in terms of offerings in Vassal and events in Tabletop Simulator. And for me, I find Vassal actually much more intuitive than Tabletop Simulator, and yet I know that for many, many players, it's exactly the opposite, that Vassal seems very quirky or non-obvious, whereas Tabletop Simulator, you can just reach out and play and go. So I don't know if it's just a way that people's psychology differs, or if it's cultural, generational, I have no idea. But I actually find Vassal quite friendly. Yes, and Der Blaue Klaus says some Vassal modules out there that are great. Some are more easy to use and some are less easy to use. And there's such a wide range of modules. First of all, they're just out there, which is wonderful because so many conflict simulation games are covered in Vassal by shareware, by folks doing it for the love of it, I think, for the most part. And of course, some of them are very fancy, and some of them are quite stripped down. But it's a wealth of highly accessible tools under the rubric of Vassal that I have just found extremely fun. We have had games among my local group that we never would have played face to face because we couldn't get everybody together. but using Vassal, we all, are able to get together, show up at the same time, and play multiplayer campaigns that, surpass, I think, anything we would have ever done at somebody's house on a weeknight evening. All right, in about 1 more minute, we can start the conversation proper about Labyrinth or anything else you all would like to talk about. Alberto says, just played Fire in the Lake yesterday with a friend. We both enjoyed very much and still figuring out the different strategies. Looking forward to play in 4 when the pandemic is over. That's great. So I do like 2-player Fire in the Lake. There's, of course, a natural communist and counterinsurgent split. It's also true for me and Coin with Liberty or Death. I really actually enjoy most the 2-player British and Indians against Patriots and French. So always glad to see people playing the Coin games in different formats. Debelklaus says, Vassal enables me to play Empire of the Sun with a guy in Sweden every week that I otherwise would never have played. It's a great tool. Yeah, exactly. That's just it, right? We turn to these tools. There's a little bit of maybe a barrier. It's not intuitive, so we have to get over that technical hump, just like me trying to use YouTube Studio today. But the needs of the time, right? They goad us to overcome that hump, and then once we're over that hump, there are just possibilities that open up with these tools. So I think that's really wonderful. All right, well, 3:20 my time, 09:20 California time. So thanks for joining me. I see we have 10 participants. That's terrific. I am just here to chat with you really about what you want to. The proximate call is to talk about my game Labyrinth, The War on Terror, which is, of course, on available via Playdeck on Steam. And if I don't have questions, then you're at risk of me just talking about whatever I think is interesting, but probably not interesting to most or many of you. So I will rely on your questions to guide me. And everything is fair game. I'm happy to talk about really anything related to conflict simulation gaming. It can be Labyrinth, it can be other games as well, anything that you like. And my my contract is to stick around with you for as much as 2 hours, as long as anybody wants to ask questions. I suspect it won't. We'll run out of questions before then, but that's my schedule. So I'll just say, with regard to Labyrinth, as I look back on it, I am looking back on it, and this may be a bit different for folks who are perhaps playing it via Playdeck for the first time, or looking at it and not having played it. For me, it's actually nostalgic to see this Playdeck port come out and have people playing it and discovering it, because, of course, I designed it over a decade ago. And I wanted to give a little of the context to it, because Labyrinth, as a conflict simulation game, it's not unique, but it is a rare animal in that it's not just about a specific period in history. It's an artifact of that same period of history. So I designed it after some conversations with Gene Billingsley of GMT Games during the summer of 2009, and it was published in 2010. So 2009, 2010 is the era whose thoughts the game inevitably will portray. And of course, we know different things and much more now, looking back, than I or any other folks on the team knew at that time about the progress of history. And what I tried to do back then in 2009 is use some experience that I had professionally to draw on, to try to encapsulate in a 2-player game the strategic premises that drove the global strategy of 2 sides in what was called the War on Terror. And in one case, I really focused on the U.S. administrations and at the time, And on the other side, I really focused on Al-Qaeda and what we thought we knew about how either of those sides viewed the world, and to try to take those views, which might or might not be how the world really works, but nevertheless drove strategy, and distill them into game mechanics. And that's the origin of things like governance as not only objective, but as a part of the dynamic terrain of the board. The fact that for the U.S., the better the governance in a theater on the part of an ally, for example, against Al-Qaeda, the better the governance, the easier it is for the U.S. to do things. The worse the governance, actually, the easier it is for the terrorists to do things. That comes from an assumption or a premise, more accurately, of first the Bush administration that I think was largely adopted by the Obama administration too, at the time, that tyranny breeds terror, to put it in a short catchphrase. That if you have accountable governance, that's an important part of good governance, and accountable governance tends not to feed the radicalization that fuels extremist movements like Al-Qaeda. And there is a lot of basis to debate that one way or the other. That's a premise. But what to me was a fact was that premise did drive the larger counter-terrorist strategy of the US administration. And so the experiment in Labyrinth is, okay, well, let's put that into effect, let players interact in that environment and make it a reality for Al-Qaeda. And then we'll put in some of Al-Qaeda's premises as well. And where do they come in the game? For example, that terrorism is a tactic, but it's a tactic to a larger objective. There might be a revenge component to jihadist terrorism at the time. There might have been, probably was, but that wasn't ultimately the reason for undertaking these operations. What were the reasons? So Labyrinth tries to provide some premise of that from the Al-Qaeda point of view, and it shows in particular that these terrorist operations would garner support, would gain attention to their cause, including friendly attention to their cause, and most importantly, that plays out in terms of funding from donors to these groups and these movements. And all of that is aiming towards what? It's a political objective, and it has to do with, again, governance, which is that extremist view of what real Islamic government would be, something akin to what the Taliban had in Afghanistan in 2001. And so the jihadist player then would attempt to diminish the accountable governance to the point that target governments would be weak enough to be overcome in an Islamist, hardline Islamist revolution. And so you have Islamist rule as the objective. And again, does that work? At the time that I designed in 2009, there was no Islamic State, and there wasn't a lot of examples in which that had really worked. But I put it into the game as part of the fundamentals because that's what Al-Qaeda was trying to do. That was their strategy and their objective. And so we have at least a simulation of something that was real, which is the perspectives of these two combatants, although not necessarily, and this is a tricky part in simulating something so recent or present at the time, not necessarily how the world really works. That is to say, it might be the case that neither side's premises actually work in the real world, but what we're playing out here is what they each thought would work. So I have from Jedrick, and I apologize with regard to pronunciation. Hi Volko, got one question on balancing how much it differs in coins, majority of which are up to 4 players versus 2-player games like Labyrinth. And that's the first part of Jedrick's 2-part question. The second part being, I have this feeling that in general for CDGs, there's always a side which is easier to play, and second, which is during the learning process, runner-up for fewer games. So if I understand the question, there's a number of aspects to that that are interesting and challenging to me from a design point of view. commercial hobby games as opposed to analytic research or training games, play balance is quite important. And we want to offer, and players, I think, expect when they're sitting down, they have essentially an equal chance as best as we can achieve to win. And not the case that somebody has to take a disadvantaged side. And so for starters, how do you achieve that if a historical contest isn't necessarily balanced? And a part of that might have to be the crafting of the victory conditions. That is to say, winning a game might not necessarily mean winning the battle or winning the war. If you say, well, a side is historically unlikely to win that war, then really you're saying, well, it just needs to do a little better than history. For example, in Barbarossa to Berlin about strategic World War II, the Axis side just has to hold on past 1945. It doesn't mean they'll win the war. You just beat history. That's a balancing mechanism in victory conditions. And that kind of balancing, as your question, Yedrick, implies, can indeed be trickier in a two-player game like Labyrinth than it is in a multiplayer game like the Coin Series. And why is that? Because if you have a multiplayer game, very likely there is an aspect of diplomacy going on among the players, and an incentive to prevent any one player from achieving an automatic victory condition, depending on how you structure the rules. And the Coin Series is structured in a certain way to bring this effect about, which is not necessarily a popular effect. The crabs in the bucket is the phrase that the bottom crabs always pull the top crab down. In the Coin Series, that's purposeful. We give players the tools to defend their position, yes, but against the crabs trying to pull you back down from winning and getting out of the bucket. But also the tools to pull the other players back, so that to some degree the play balance is handed off to the multiple players who are all responsible for keeping each other in check while they also advance their own position in that kind of multiplayer situation. Well, in a two-player game like Labyrinth, we can't do that. The game itself has to be as balanced as it can be. And it's very difficult to achieve because we can only run so many experiments, and because we have volunteers who are playtesting, and it takes a certain amount of time. And then when you take the results of any given set of tests, you make changes, you adjust, and now the game is different because there are ripple effects in this interlocking system of the game design. And so really all of the previous experiments have now been diminished in the value as data because they really were playing a different older version of the game. And so by the time you publish a game, you've done the best you can to achieve balance, but you know that if the game is successful and then hundreds and thousands of people play it many times, of course, you're going to have a much better understanding after the thing is printed than before what the play balance is. So it's always it's always hard to achieve perfection there. And I agree that's true in the Coin Series as well. They're absolutely, despite our best efforts, I would say, for example, in Falling Sky, which is about Caesar in Gaul, in that Coin Series volume, it's not that necessarily the factions are unbalanced, that optimal play will lead to more victories for one faction over another necessarily, but there are factions that are harder to get to optimal play with, that are harder to learn. The Roman machine just has to be finely tuned, and if it's played out to its maximum effectiveness, it's a very powerful faction, the Romans, but it's not necessarily easy to play it to its maximum perfection. And so it's a little harder to play the Romans than the Belgi in that way. Once everybody's up to speed, a Roman player can take care of himself, but it's that getting there that's the difficulty. And so I think part of the responsibility of designers after publication is to, first of all, keep track of that and do any amelioration, any mitigation that's possible in later editions, but mainly to put that out there that, we've discovered, if you haven't already put it in the design notes, for example, or in the strategy tips or whatever, we've discovered that, this faction tends to win more than others as people are learning the game. So try to give your more confident players or your more experienced players the factions that are harder to learn, and you'll have a better first experience, for example. So let me look on Der Blaue Klaus. No. Peter Baumann, hi. Do you think that Labyrinth contains less of a luck element than Twilight Struggle, as it has more roles with each one having less importance than Twilight Struggle? Yeah, thanks. I'm probably, I'm going to be, I know Twilight Struggle. I played it a good deal. When it came out, I played it in a prototype version with Ananda and Jason, very early on. So I do know Twilight Struggle, and it absolutely was a basis for Labyrinth, and I think that that's clear if you've played both games. I won't say that I'm near as expert on Twilight Struggle as many people, probably many of you, are. So I'm a little bit of at a risk of hazard making comparisons between the two. And I think I understand that in Twilight Struggle, perhaps it's the coup role that gets some attention as being impactful, and there aren't necessarily that many of them. And as your question, Peter, implies, it becomes a problem with luck if any one experiment, any one die roll or particular card in the deck has too much impact on the outcome. And so I don't know. I don't know whether Labyrinth escapes that charge. I can certainly see how if you're the jihadist player and you failed several major jihads in a row because of the dice, you may, you might rightly feel, well, I was defeated by luck. My strategy was okay. I just never got the numbers I needed. Or on the other side of that, as the U.S. player, you're rolling dice too for the war of ideas to, the main way that you're going to achieve your victory conditions, again, based on a die roll. And the hope is that in both of those cases, there are enough dice being rolled that you regress to the mean, as my designer friend Harold Buchanan puts it, that by and large over most games, it's not going to be the case that the dice will have been what determined the full course of the game. But I have to leave that up to you. My reason for dice in my games, when I do use them, is because I feel that apparent uncertainty, that apparent randomness of complex affairs from the point of view of the decision makers is so important to the dilemmas they face, their attempts to manage uncertainty, that if I have the outcomes be too deterministic, it's not a plausible model to me of the uncertainties that we face. In CDGs in general, Twilight Struggle, Labyrinth, and many others, whatever the luck is of any dice rolls that are in there, there's also the way that the cards are dealt out. Which cards do you get when? How often do you get a strong hand in Labyrinth or Twilight Struggle? How often do you get a weak hand? And so between those two multiple random experiments, there is, at least I think in CDGs, an even greater possibility than in typical consim, well, older style consim games that don't use cards, that are not card-driven games, for these the randomness to cancel out in the end. So hopefully Labyrinth in most game playings will do that to an acceptable degree. Klaus, would you say that your design stood the test of time game-wise in a simulation? I mean, that's kind of a question I have for you. It's a great one. Labyrinth was, when it came out, and in the intervening time, controversial, in my view as a designer, in a very good way, because it led to many insightful critiques and exchanges of views that were about the real world that we live in and about highly consequential issues like jihadism and Western counterterrorist policy and so forth, around a common framework. This is something I think that's very powerful that a game can do when it's about something, is we all play the game and then we all react to whatever the designer did in the game, the model of international affairs, the model of warfare, whatever it is, we're all reacting to the designer's model by comparing it to our own that we already have, that we already bring to the table. We all knew something about, Al-Qaeda before we ever played War on Terror, Labyrinth, the War on Terror. But we're able to express that, our own model, by contrasting it with what the game has to say. And so for starters, I cannot have hoped with Labyrinth in 2009 to forecast anything, to say, well, here's what the War on Terror will look like in 2020, to the degree to which there still is one. That would have been very fraught to try to do that with a simple model like this. The world is far too complex, I think, to do that effectively in a tabletop simulation. However, it at a minimum stood the test of time, I would say, in that we're still playing it and we're still talking about it. And now we ought to, going back to my original point when I kicked off a few minutes ago, we ought to look at it in the context of this was a vision of how it looked in 2009, 2010. What went differently? What new factors and actors came in that are not there in the original design? And we have wonderfully Trevor Bender's follow-ons, Labyrinth Awakening and Labyrinth Forever War, where he is updating and expanding my original model to give it fidelity, greater fidelity to more recent events. And so I'm very proud of that. It's Trevor's work, 100%. I'm very proud of what he was able to do, building off a base system, a postulate of 2009 and 2010, to incorporate dynamics that followed, which changed radically. So there are things I can point to that are in the original design that I think bore out reasonably well, and certainly things in the original design or missing from the original design that should have been there. And I can find both of those in ample number. So an example would be, as I mentioned, in the game, the jihadist side is trying to take over countries, in effect, and establish extremist Islamist rule, which had not much happened in 2009. We had the Taliban in Afghanistan for a time, and we had some things happening in Somalia that approached that. But we didn't really have anything like an Al-Qaeda-like ideological jihadist movement controlling anything like a country until we did in the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And that case to me showed, okay, this is what Al-Qaeda was aiming for sometime in the future, and the Islamic State, that group just thought, well, we're going to do it even faster, and here's an opportunity to do it in the context of the conflicts in Syria and Iraq. And so that in Labyrinth would be Islamist rule, given further specificity in the caliphate mechanics that Trevor brings in later. We had, on the tactical level, we had the possibility, which hadn't happened in 2009, we had the possibility that bin Laden might be gotten. I mean, it's clear that he was being hunted already, so we put in that possibility, and then that happened. What's missing? I think the original design, the biggest thing I think of in the original design that does not stand the test of time very well, is that pre-awakening, I think the principal model I was using was outside influences on Muslim governance in the context of the war of ideas, so-called, being a key engine for improving governance and thereby countering ideologies like jihadism. What we saw in the awakening about some time after, started just a few months after publication actually of the game, is that impulse was there very strongly in the Muslim world to provide more accountable regimes, But what we saw in Tunisia and Egypt and Syria is that they are welling up from within in very dramatic ways, and then can lead to a reaction that leads, tragically, especially in cases like Syria and Yemen, to civil wars that overwhelm all efforts at reform of governance by normal civil means. Well, none to very, very little of that is in original Labyrinth, and to get that aspect in a model, you have to play Trevor's expansions. All right, hi, Blue Tweezers. Were any events just too difficult to put into the game? God, that's a good question. I thought that I pushed the limit on that, and I think that extends also to my my game set in modern times in the coin series as well. And I guess push the limit is maybe not the right phrase. I don't know that I set myself a limit and said, here is something that's really important, that happened, that's really important, that is just too painful or too unpleasant. If you look at some of the events and images in Labyrinth, you know, the images that we chose to use for Abu Ghraib, for example, or in Andean Abyss, some of the images that we use for the terrorism that was going on in the context of the civil war in that country in the 1990s and early 2000s, I think you'll see that we didn't balk. I mean, it was not an attempt there to dampen the darkness of it, to you know, to whatever, you know, dampen the raw impact of it. I was trying to do my best to model what I saw and transport players into that world, with the presumption that if what you're looking to play is a game that is subtitled, you know, The War on Terror or Insurgency in Colombia, that you're not going to be deterred by gritty realism if that's the topic you're choosing to play. So I guess my answer is actually no. I can't think of any events where I'm like, okay, that's important, but we're not going to put it in because it's too difficult. And if that didn't get at what you meant, Blue Tweezers, by too difficult, then ask a new, repeat the question with what you mean by too difficult. Hi, Michael. Okay, so Michael Gang asks, would you officially call Labyrinth, quote, coin volume 0? So I think that officially I wouldn't, but unofficially I think that has some merit. My first published game was Wilderness War, about the French-Indian War, and I designed that in the year 2000, so a decade earlier, from Labyrinth. I did Labyrinth on commission, in effect, from Gene Billingsley at GMT, and when Labyrinth was completed and was successful with the market, then I felt it was my turn to come back to Gene and say, well, I'd like to ask you to put onto your pre-order list my next design, which is a topic of my choosing, which was Colombia, and Andean Abyss, what became volume 1 of the coin series. And it was, for me, very much a natural progression from one to the other, and an attempt to learn how to do things better and to do more. And so, for example, substantively, a premise of Labyrinth is that the war on terror was a global insurgency and counterinsurgency, an insurgency that Al-Qaeda was attempting to light and lead to challenge what it saw as the wrong type of government in the Muslim world and overthrow them, including by violence, and establish new ones. And they were using, with their terrorism, some fairly classic insurgent tactics, especially Che Guevara's Volko theory of dramatic, violent acts that would draw the support and interest of the populace to rise up and follow with such acts. And so I was already looking at the situation as insurgency and counterinsurgency, and I was involved in helping teach those topics in my day job. And I wanted to zero in on insurgency and counterinsurgency at the national level, not this rather necessarily vague or global scale, but actually one country. And Colombia offered a really rich story, but it was clear from that story that there were many actors who were dealing with each other with competing visions. And so the transition from 2-player Labyrinth to 4-player in most of the coin games was a natural one, because I thought, okay, first of all, there's some criticism out there with merit that Labyrinth being a 2-player game is a bit of an oversimplification for what were very loose alliances and movements on either side. To boil those down to 2 players was maybe a bit of a severe simplification. And what if I had 4 players to work with? I could give a better model of what's going on in insurgency, which is political military conflict that is always multi-sided, the experts tell us. And since I had experimented in Labyrinth with providing a ability to play as the US side and the game system would run the jihadists, a bot, I thought, can I pull that off to allow a player to play as one faction among 4, and all 3 other players are then represented by bots that would be contained in the box. So that was a challenge I set myself in Andean Abyss that grew out of Labyrinth. Final example I'll give on that is in Labyrinth, originally, there were the cells, the jihadist cells, which are now the cylinders, the octagonal cylinders with a symbol on one end, were just cubes, and the US could go disrupt and kill them. And it became very clear that that was not working as a model, that we needed to have some way to show cells that were still underground that needed to be targeted first, exposed in some way, before you could go kill them with disruption. And after trying various things, that's how we ended up with these cylinders that were embossed on one end, and you'd have the embossed side up to be the exposed cells, active cells who could be killed. Well, that clearly was the same mechanic then I transported into Colombia and Andean Abyss for guerrillas that first needed to be exposed, activated before they could be assaulted and killed by the counterinsurgent forces. So there are elements. In fact, there are more that I can think of just sitting here. Dual use cards, dual use event cards, for example, events that have 2 different competing meanings. For me, I'm trying to learn as I go. I hopefully am, pushing myself to use design tools more effectively in more and more recent efforts than my older efforts. And so from Wilderness War to Labyrinth to Andean Abyss, that to me is absolutely a natural progression, which you could say, therefore, Labyrinth is proto-coin, or coin volume 0, as you put it. All right, sorry, just trying to catch where we were. Okay. Peter asks, do you know whether the expansions will also be available to the playdeck version of Labyrinth? So that is a question for playdeck proper. However, my understanding from them is that that is their intent. I just don't know. I just do not honestly know the status and the prognosis and the schedule for that. But my understanding is that at some point the plan would be to offer Forever War. Awakening and Forever War, presumably in that order. Now, let me give a caveat. I'm not speaking here officially for playdeck, so I really am only giving you what my suspicion is, if you take it that. And my apologies that I'm not in a position to speak authoritatively on what playdeck intends to do. All right, and Michael asks, also since the stream is related to the Steam Tabletop Fest, I'm really curious about what that. Have you got the info from playdeck about following expansions? Okay, so it's the same question, and sorry to disappoint, I don't have authoritative information. Let me put it this way. I'm very hopeful and optimistic that, because it makes sense to me, that at some point we will get Trevor's expansions through the same playdeck platform. Greg asks, I enjoy the Bender expansions, but I wonder if the expansions kind of compromise the Labyrinth player base. Like, what expansions do you use when playing Terraforming Mars? Oh, I only play with all the modules. I quote, I only play with Prelude. That's interesting, and I don't, and makes some sense. I have to say, for myself, I'm in the school of more offerings and more variety is better. I think I do understand. For example, when you design a game and you publish it, do you put in optional rules? This is the same kind of dilemma, I think, if I understand your comment, Greg. On the one hand, we would like to give the players control to readily tune the product to their own preferences, right? Well, here's an option. If you want to have more detail, then use this option. If that's too much detail, don't use this option. However, the dilemma is now you've made it more complicated, as you point out, Greg. You've made it more complicated for the consumer to choose, to find agreement and to know what's being played. And so now every time you sit down, or if there's a tournament, you have to specify, well, we're using optional rule A, but we're not using optional rule B and C. And that's not necessarily a better experience. I don't know that there's any way to resolve that dilemma cleanly. I tend to want, I'm a tinkerer anyway. I mean, I'm a designer. So how did I get to be a designer? Well, I bought games and I played them and I said, I actually think I would like it better if we changed this little way. So I'm a big fan of house rules. There's been a very interesting discussion I know recently on BGG and onto Twitter about our house rules and board games, a good thing, a bad thing, when should they be encouraged, when not. I'm very pro house rule because that's how I approach the product. I love the fact, going back to the technology issue, I love the fact that with this technology of a tabletop manual game, you can adjust it to taste with a pencil. It's just, I think that's a strength in it. And so I like to implement lots of options. I like to give a lot of control to players to do that. And I encourage people to come up with an experiment with house rules and let everybody else know how it's going. I think Trevor's effort goes far beyond that, though, in its benefit, which is not only to give you something fresh, but that after you've played Labyrinth enough that you've kind of seen it and you've experienced the deck, but to show what is needed and possible in bringing this model from 2009 up to 2015 or 2020 and perhaps beyond. I mean, I just find that extremely fascinating exercise to say, okay, well, here's a lot of things that were not foreseen in 2009. Can we still take that basic engine built back then and provide a plausible 2015? And I think Trevor has done that excellently, and I sure wouldn't give that up. I think that's worth perhaps the conversations you have to have about, well, if we're going to play this, which version are we going to play? But like I say, that's a matter of taste. Okay, Bluetooth, I actually meant mechanics-wise on difficulty, i.e. could not fit within the mechanics. What event card effect were you most proud of? Very good. No, I don't think there's any event where I was like, well, that's too hard to put in. I will talk about a design problem that I've already touched on that I simply could not solve. But in terms of individual events, if there was something I could think of that I thought had enough impact on the world stage in the context of the War on Terror, I wanted to put it in. And it's really, so concept game design is fundamentally simplification. That is what the designer is doing, because the designer is building a model that a player has to execute. That is, the player has to read the rules of the model. How does it work? And operate those rules more or less correctly when the designer is not in the room. And the operator has to find that endeavor fun. That is, it can't be such a pain in the butt because it's so complicated to do that, that it's not going to be enjoyable to do that. And that means that the difficult part of concept game design is simplifying. Once you accept that what you're doing as a designer is simplifying complex human affairs, simplifying history, really simplifying it into a tabletop game, then that's the bread and butter. That's the name of that's the name of the game. That's what you're doing. So if you have an event that's consequential, well, of course it's very complicated. But the whole point of your sitting down and trying to design this game is to take that very complex affair and somehow express it in very simple mechanics. So it would be no, it would be too much of a fail to say, well, that's important, but it's just too complicated. Now, that doesn't mean put everything in. The reason you would put something in within is it's within your scope. You've got a focus, you've got a scope. There's a certain boundary. You can't simulate the universe. You're simplifying a certain slice of the universe in time and space and in discipline and affairs, whatever it is. In this case, the war on terror from 2001 to 2010 or so. And there's all kinds of things that are happening that are outside that scope, and it's right to leave them out. But if it's consequential for that scope, if there was an event that was consequential globally to the war on terror 2001 to 2010, or 2009 when I was designing it, and I thought of it, I don't think I would have or should have allowed myself to just leave it out, because I couldn't come up with a good enough idea how to simplify it. So I hope that answers. What event card effect was I most proud of? Yeah, that's a hard question. I will say I was very proud, to some degree, I was very proud of putting in the possibility that the US could get bin Laden, which hadn't happened. But I have to pull back on that pride in two respects. One is it's a dual use card, and I had already come up with this idea that events often have two different ways they can go. One way that might favor the US, one way that might favor the jihadists. And this concept was carried forward in the coin series on the same card. And it's very often one of those would be counterfactual. So there's a bin Laden card, which is for the jihadists. It's the bin Laden basically making hay, laughing at the US that he's still alive and he's out there. On the other side of that is they got him. The US got him, and he can no longer do that. So, okay, that was already kind of inherent in the way I was structuring the cards to do those cards. The second is, actually, it was in response to feedback from Gene Billingsley that we added more of the hunt for leaders. So we came up with a bunch of leader cards like that. So it wasn't even my original idea. I was going to mention something that I thought was a design challenge, a larger design challenge in Labyrinth that, I couldn't crack. And it goes back to, how does the thing work? What are the premises of how the war on terror worked at the strategic global scale? I used the premises that I thought the US administration had at the time and that Al-Qaeda had at the time, and I pitted them against each other. Neither of those mean that they're necessarily really the way things worked or what drove outcomes. So in a way, if what you're looking to do is really reproduce the war on terror, Labyrinth, there's a limitation there, because Labyrinth of necessity had to put the players in those roles to have them have the incentives to execute those strategies, even if we now look back and we'd say, well, those strategies were both bunk. Neither the Bush administration nor Al-Qaeda really understood where this was going to go. And the Labyrinth has to cloak itself in this idea that those worldviews on either side worked, because otherwise the players won't execute those worldviews and you're not playing the war on terror. So, it's a catch-22 design that I don't think I cracked. Let's see. Okay, HB. Hello, HB. Rumor is when you're designing a game, you play music from the period, eat food from the period, and surround yourself with items from the period. How did that manifest itself for Labyrinth? It's true, and it's not maybe so much the period as what I think was necessary, not just for design of Labyrinth, but if you were working in intelligence in any way touching counterterrorism at that time, the first decade plus of this century, you were mainly dealing with Islamist extremists. And so culturally, what you were or should have been soaking up is that ethos, including for many of us, first of all, basic grounding in Islam, and secondly, in the cultures of that of which Islam is a dominant feature. So that would be Arab and Persian and South Asian and so forth. So yes, so I had and have and still enjoy Arabic music and Persian music and that kind of thing, and that was true of that time. Yedrick asks, COVID-related topics will sooner or later appear in heavier games. What do you think will be its perception in the gaming community? Yeah, not sure if I fully understand the question. This is not something I admit I have thought of, but you're absolutely right. We're going to certainly at some point see simulations that take on dynamics among people that are influenced by the pandemic, the lockdown, the economic dislocations, and so forth. And it won't be by me. I have no plan to design that sort of thing. But it will be very interesting, and I have no forecast for you on what that perception will be. It will be certainly, I will be among those very interested in seeing how do those models play out. What is it that strikes designers that there is to say? What stories are there to tell from this time of pandemic? It is interesting if when you go back and watch, older movies that feature pandemics. My son Andrew, co-designer of mine, he happens to be rereading Max Brooks' World War Z, and he was just commenting to me the other day. It's very interesting reading a book trying to be realistic about a zombie pandemic, a global pandemic, now after experiencing the COVID pandemic. So it's the same for game designs, I think, as it is for books or movies or other media, that you can actually go back and now, if you play Pandemic now, do you think about that differently? Do you imagine it differently? Do you critique that model differently, knowing what we now know going through the current pandemic? An interesting exercise. And so, yes, I don't know. The horizons are open on that, designers. Would you play something for us on the piano? You do not want me to do that, HB. Trust me. I would attempt to do a little salsa dance for you, but you would be too horrified. The piano is not mine, actually. Jill plays the piano a little bit. Andrew plays the piano, and that piano actually is not even in tune. The piano they use now is an electric one that's around the corner. My house rule. Okay, you are known for liberal use of house rules. What are your house rules for play of Labby? I am liberal in the use of house rules for games that I did not design, because I think because I want to adjust them to taste. So with Labyrinth, with the additions that we've had, the multiple additions that we've had, if there were adjustments that I wanted to make, I've made them, and there actually were not many, happily. So I can give you house rules I would use for Nevsky, which is only out last year and still in its first edition. And since Nevsky's been published, I've discovered I don't like the balance of one of the 6 scenarios. So I would certainly house rule that scenario. And if I have the opportunity, I And I've put this out there. So there's inside GMT, I have an article about scenario balance in Nevsky and what my views on it are post-publication. And it proposes a series of house rules to adjust the particular scenario in question to what I think achieves a better play balance. But I don't have anything like that for Labyrinth because in its current form, it's the form that's to my taste. I'll quickly follow up and say, I highly encourage everybody to adjust Labyrinth to their taste by whatever house rules seem to help do that. Greg, this is going back to the question of Awakening and I presume Forever War also as an expansion. Greg writes, tournaments and conventions is where my question is focused. You have to know Awakening to play in the WBC Labyrinth tournament. Yeah, but great for in-home play. Yeah, and so so I don't think I have much to add to that observation, but perhaps to commiserate. So I guess I would, on the side of favoring the advent of expansions to games, even in the context of tournaments, I would say that tournaments are like any other endeavor, like clubs or like discussions like we're having here. They're such individual affairs, and who you have that is running a tournament, as you know, makes a great deal of difference in terms of how satisfying the outcome is and how fun the experience is. And so hopefully great tournament managers, great game masters will take the best advantage of a wider range of choices. And in the case of a specific thing like the Labyrinth tournament at the World Board Gaming Championships, I'm happy that the folks who are designing, running, and participating in those tournaments and giving feedback would have a more colorful palette to choose from. Particularly if it's something that happens repeatedly, particularly if there's a tournament each year, I'd rather not have them be locked into just doing the same thing. I'd rather say, well, if the demand is there to do it, if the idea is there to do it, to say, well, we can try the expansion and add that next year and see how it goes. And if we don't like that, we can drop back and go back to the original or not. So I still, I guess, from a design point of view, come back to I'd rather equip you to tune the thing to your preferences. And in the context of a tournament, it means giving the full room to that conversation between the game masters and the participants to design the event that they think will be the most fun. Der Blaue Klaus, with Gandhi out and since we celebrate 30 years of reunification here in Germany, is there any plan to design a coin game on the peaceful revolution in Germany or the Eastern Bloc in general? Blaue Klaus, I don't know of any design in work on that topic. So we have Wir sind das Volk. I haven't played it, but it's very popular, but it seems to be in that same setting. And of course we have 1989 as a CDG. I certainly would love to see such a design, but I don't know of one. We may get something in modern Europe. There is a World War II Yugoslavia design, but I don't know of anything that has to do with East-West affairs, German unification, and all like that. So if anybody's looking to design something like that, please drop me a line. Michael, thanks for answering. You're certainly welcome. Yeah, so it's Michael just commenting, like Labyrinth and Coin, I just love war games that are less dice focused and yet seriously dynamic and strategic. Thank you. Yeah, and of course, it's easier to be less dice focused if you have randomly dealt event cards in the game. And so, for example, in the coin series, there's been a lot of comment on the fact that much of the combat, at least in the modern setting games, is deterministic. It's just, one cube kills one piece, or two cubes kill one piece, and that's it. And how, why did I do that? Why isn't it dice to resolve combat, as in many conflict simulations? And how do we get away with that? It's nice from a time point of view, you're not gathering and rolling and interpreting so many dice rolls, so that speeds things along. And you can't say the outcome of combat was luck dependent, or can you? So the way that the coin series gets away with that is that the cards are semi-random, and the outcome of combat very often is determined by who gets the initiative, who gets the first blow to strike or to run away or hide, and that's determined by these cards turning up and the initiative order. That is then, it's semi-random because it's drawn from a deck that has all the same permutations for each side in it, and those cards run out as you go on. And it's semi-random because it's related to player choices about what operations and which events to do when it's their turn. And so they can influence the combat by deciding to put an emphasis on that combat and doing something operationally, or taking advantage of some event that affects something else somewhere else, for example. So there's still a good amount of randomness in there, even though the combat itself involves no dice. And very briefly, why did I do that for the modern guerrilla campaigns? It's because the idea is that in guerrilla warfare, the individual combats, while they may be very, very chaotic, there are many, many small combats in guerrilla warfare rather than big decisive battles that then affect the course of the war. When you have many, many small experiments in real life, they tend to be predictable in terms of the overall effect. So it almost becomes a statistical exercise. Well, how often are we finding guerrillas? What are the kill ratios and so forth? And so the premise at the national level of simulation in, say, Andean Abyss is that the government more or less knows where the large guerrilla formations are. Those are the hidden guerrilla pieces. If they find them and fix them, know exactly where they are to attack them, those are the revealed or activated guerrilla pieces. And if they're in there and they carry out an assault operation, they kind of know. They know, what the results are going to be of that sweep through that particular Department of Columbia, for example, if that makes sense. To put it differently, how much potential do I see in coin series as a political game? So I see a lot of potential in the coin series core engine as a political game, and I hope you do too. And that's not coincidental. It's because that's what I designed the engine to do, and that is to take on internal conflicts in which it wasn't just military affairs that determined outcomes. And it never is. It's just that in insurgencies, the political aspects, political tools, political warfare on alongside military come to the fore. And so I leveraged this very, I think, powerful effect of the card-driven game system that Mark Herman came up with way back in the early 90s with We the People to bring different disciplines into a military dynamic, to bring in politics via event cards. And then I tried in the coin series to go beyond that by having many of the activities themselves be almost purely political or economic. For example, in the case of the cartel, which is a commercial insurgency, if you will, in Colombia, in Andean Abyss, and to allow all of those disciplines to interact: political, military, economic, some cultural, some personalities, and so forth, when you bring in all the different event cards going on. So that should make it a fairly natural exercise to adjust that focus in another coin volume in which political tools are even more important and military tools are less important or even absent. And so to me, it is a natural progression that we get to in Gandhi from Bruce Mansfield, or People Power from Ken T, the upcoming volume on the Philippines, in which there are factions that aren't really using military warfare at all. Passive resistance and active resistance and the like. So nonviolent factions, you could have a game where all the factions are ineffectively nonviolent. Why not? We've already gone to the point where half of them are in Gandhi, and I think it works very well. Nash says, I recently discovered a distant plane, and at first I made the mistake of putting underground move. Yes. Why did I change the rule from Labyrinth? Okay, thank you for the question. I know exactly what you're referring to. So the first of all, what is the contrast here? In Labyrinth, if you travel your cells, they may be at risk depending on where you're traveling. If you try to go across the world, you might get caught just for traveling and die. But if you successfully travel, you flip your cells back to their hidden underground, unactivated nature. And in Andean Abyss and several of the coin games, it's actually the opposite, that if you move guerrillas into an area that your enemy has eyes and ears in, that controls, has the popular support and some troops, you can actually become revealed just by moving your assets. So it's an opposite model. And so the question is, what, so that can be confusing. If you're playing Labyrinth and you're thinking, well, this is coin volume 0, and then you play a coin game and it's actually the opposite effect. So sorry for that being confusing. That I understand is natural. The reason is because of what I was trying to model in each case, with, again, a simplification, a vast simplification of real life complexities. When we are looking to identify very small groups of individuals, as represented in some cases by the cell pieces in Labyrinth, we're not talking about a lot of people here. On a global or near global scale, a cell might just be a single-digit handful of operatives. When you're trying to identify these people and they just sit in one place and plot before they do anything, that can make them very difficult to find. If they have to move through a hostile environment, you might catch them, and that's why those cells, if you're not going adjacent or using some kind of card, can be eliminated by traveling. However, once you do spot them, how do they evade? They might now relocate. And so we have both the danger of travel for the cells and the ability to simplify by using the same mechanic, the same order, to be a mechanism for them to, again, go underground. The simplification in the coin series in Andean Abyss for guerrillas is trying to get at a different effect. And this is the effect of the information battle between larger groups of forces. These are now military units that the guerrillas are fielding, and government forces to dominate an area in terms of information. And where does the information come from? It comes from the people who live there, who are the eyes and ears there. And the question is, who are they cooperating with in informing on the other side? And so the effect I was trying to get at, the dynamic of guerrilla warfare that I was trying to get at, different from the traveling of individual operatives and the ability of a cell to evade detection by relocating, is that if a guerrilla force moves into an area that the government dominates in terms of the sentiments, especially if the government has forces there that can protect those people, then the chances are very high that the identity of those guerrilla forces are going to be reported to the government forces. On the other hand, if it's an area where the population is friendly to the guerrillas, or there just aren't any government forces to report to or to protect you if you do report or to act on that information. So in the case of Andean Abyss, this would be for the FARC, this would be opposition in that particular department. Well, now if the guerrillas come in, the government's not going to get any information because it's the guerrillas who, through those sentiments of the people, control the area. So that's a pretty complicated explanation. You can see I'm trying to, in each of those cases, boil down fairly complicated dynamics into very simple rules like you flip that piece up or you flip that piece down. And it just happens to work out in those two contexts of complex dynamics that the simplifications I thought were the best go in opposite directions. So I think that might be a little bit hard to follow, but that's my attempt to explain it. Okay, Alberto asks, from the perspective of both the war on terror and game design, what are the main differences between Caliphate countries and Islamist rule countries in Labyrinth? You know, I really should, if you're asking about Caliphate countries in the expansions by Trevor, I think I should defer to Trevor on that. The Caliphate, in reality, the Caliphate of the Islamic State was the most effective physical achievement of what is Islamist rule as an objective of Al-Qaeda in the earlier period. And it also meant something in the non-material way, because it was a declaration that a new time had arrived, because we have, we, the Muslims, according to the Islamic State, we have a caliph and we have a caliphate, and that is the ultimate legitimacy. And if you are a Muslim and not loyal to the caliph and not part of the caliphate, it just puts a point from the point of view of the Islamic State's message. It just puts a point on your illegitimacy. And so that's sort of my guess at what the differences are between just Islamist rule and caliphate in the game. But that game is not mine. And Trevor is going to be a part of this Game Fest very shortly, I believe. And so I hope you'll have the opportunity to ask him that question, because it's a great question. I actually would like to hear the answer as well. So that's all I see now for questions. We are at almost 4:30. So again, my deep apologies for the 20-minute delay. We've gone for more than an hour. I can continue for a half hour. I'm happy to talk about Consim games and game design and Labyrinth in particular all day, and I can stay for another half hour. So if anybody has any other questions or comments, please put them into chat. Otherwise, if we have run the course for today, enjoy the rest of the game chat, and I will sign off. I'll just give a few seconds in case anybody's typing. Yeah, Deborah Klaus says, thank you for GameStop. Thank you for all the feedback. It's been a very fulfilling avocation for me to share this hobby with you all. Do I know why Playdeck did not follow the AI? So if the question means not follow the flowcharts in the box, if I'm understanding that, I would put forward a very good reason for that, and that is the twofold. Actually, there are two reasons. Reason one is that the flowcharts in the box are severely limited by the medium. They're limited by what I can intelligibly put on a single piece of paper, and hope that without too much pain, and I do think there's some pain involved, a player can execute during the course of game and still be able to enjoy playing while following this flowchart. And so that's the first thing, is I would not recommend somebody porting to a different medium, an electronic game that can be much more capable in terms of the fidelity of the AI to a player and the competitiveness of the AI. I wouldn't have an objection to starting with a paper flowchart as the basis. That's fine. But to limit yourself in that way, for Playtech to have limited itself in that way to something that was a medium that applies to a limit that applies to the older medium, would make no sense. Secondly, you should understand that my AI in the box was my first attempt at any such thing. It was sort of a challenge from Gene to, put a solitaire system in the box in case players wanted to play without having to have anybody play the terrorists. And that was the reason. I wouldn't have myself thought of the idea of even putting in an AI at all. And I, sketched it out on paper. I used the idea that the cards could help generate decisions. The events were already a kind of random generator of narrative to drive a basic algorithm and still provide variety. And that's it. It was the first cut. And I'm hopeful that the next cut in Andean Abyss was a little bit better. And what we've seen Bruce Mansfield and Vezar Ponen and others do in later volumes, we have much better paper-based AI. Labyrinth was like version 1.0 of a paper AI, and I would have, I think, it absolutely was correct to have the development of AI for Playdeck's version be in Playdeck's hands. So hopefully I've answered that question. But Playdeck could have developed an AI as they did for TSI, not following all the solo rules. Yes, that's, again, I'm not expert enough on at all. I'm not expert at all on the AI in Twilight Struggle and how that came about behind the scenes. And so in terms of, I think it's a great question for Playdeck, but not one that I can responsibly answer in terms of what was the process for Twilight Struggle AI, what was the process for AI, and how did each end up as they did. I do know a difference was that with Twilight Struggle, I don't believe they had an AI to start with. They didn't have solo rules to start with. Whereas in Labyrinth they did. And it may be that leveraging that is part of the explanation of the difference. I don't know. I'm merely guessing, but that would be a good question for Playdeck proper. And Dedrick says, thanks, have a lovely weekend, and you too. I'll pause again and see whether there's anything else. Here we have. Tom B says, would you mind sharing the story details of the knife mounted on the wall behind you? Sure, very briefly. The knife mounted on the wall behind me is not mine. That actually belongs to my wife, Jill. We were both civil servants in the intelligence community, retired. And that knife was a retirement gift from a certain intelligence outfit to her for keeping them out of legal trouble. She was an attorney. And so her job was to make sure that everything that folks like that did was compliant with US law. And that was just their way. A K-bar knife was just their way of thanking her and honoring her in her retirement. It's really cool. I wish it was mine, but it's not. Oh, and then Michael just comments in response to these, a more advanced system for AI is coming according to developers from Playdeck. So that's good news. And Nash says, thank you for sharing that. Okay, good. You guys know more about that than I do, so I'm glad. Thank you for answering that. Tom, I'd love to have lunch one day when we again are doing such things. All right, then. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of the Game Fest. I'm going to see if I can't peek in on the Labyrinth games that are going to be going on, I hope, later this evening for me, this afternoon for Pacific time. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to, but I'm going to try to. In other words, I hope to see you all online. I'm mostly on Twitter at Volko26. If you're not already bumping into me there, I hope to bump into you on Twitter if you happen to be on Twitter. And I guess with that, I'm going to, oh, wait a minute, one question. Do I have figures for how balanced is the game? How often which sides have victory? I wish I did. Certainly my impression, and those folks like Greg who are familiar with WBC tournaments, it would be great to see some stats. I haven't. I do have such information for Wilderness War, which has been around, that many more years longer. I get a more anecdotal take in terms of I'm always paying attention, when I hear about outcomes to see who's winning. And in terms of the concerns expressed about this side is hard to win with and that side is hard to win with. My own opinion actually is that if there is a balance issue that I would worry about, I would be more concerned that it's easier to win with the U.S. Once players are up to speed on both sides. However, I see more often frustrations in playing the U.S. side. So I take that as a good sign that we're in that, at least with the anecdotal, not minimal information, but it's not statistically sound information either, anecdotal information that I get, that we're in that zone of uncertainty where we really can't make a clear call to say that the game is favors one side or the other. And if anybody else who's participated in tournaments has an additional view, I'd love to see it in the comments. All right, folks, I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. Thanks so much for joining in. Have fun.